One of the things that any longtime Nintendo fan will feel at some point is a powerful sense of déjà vu. This isn't unique to Nintendo, of course. To a certain extent, all video game companies that last for more than a few years go through cycles of experimentation and consolidation, failure and, hopefully, success. But Nintendo is more consistently cyclical than most. In its 65 years as an entertainment company, Nintendo withstood treacherous downturns from 1973 to 1978, 1991 to 1995, 2001 to 2005, and 2011 to 2017. And the whiplash from these dives was exacerbated by the dizzying heights of market dominance the company reached at other times. From 1985 to 1990, from 2006 to 2010, and for most of the last decade, right up to the release of the Switch 2 in mid-2025. It's often seemed like Nintendo has no medium setting. Like for them it's always a toss-up between being the king of the mountain or the laughingstock of the industry. The Wii went from one of these extremes to the other in less than 2 years. Nintendo's insistence on experimentation, though frequently derided as an obsession with gimmicks, helped it to pick its way out of trouble more than once. But the company also needed something to sustain it, to keep the lights on while managers and designers figured out their next move. For many years, that sustenance came from Nintendo's presence in other markets. Before 1985, it would fall back on playing cards and toys, and the low but reliable profit they provided. But when it began to focus almost exclusively on video games, the company lost access to that safety net. It would eventually find a new one in, of all things, video games, but of a different kind from the ones they had made before. Most of Nintendo's successful products up to this point were pretty bulky affairs, even a lot of the toys, but especially video games. Cutting-edge virtual amusements like Donkey Kong could only be experienced through an enormous arcade cabinet. Home consoles offered a cut-down and less spectacular experience, but even these required a television to serve as a monitor, so they weren't exactly what you would call portable. Generally speaking, video games in the 1980s took up the entire living room. If you were playing them, everybody else in the house had to see and hear them at the same time, and that necessarily limited their use. Unless you were rich enough to have multiple TV sets, if your parents wanted to watch TV, you had to stop playing. Video games didn't go on family trips. They didn't travel to school functions or other kids' houses, and the thought of every child in a family having a personal game console was laughable. So when Nintendo released its Game Boy in 1989, customers and competitors alike recognized it as much more than a new video game console. It was nothing less than a revolution in how video games related to people's everyday lives. For the first time, video games, actual honest-to-God, swap out the cartridge and play whatever you want video games, fit in your pocket and could go anywhere you went. And the fact that these games weren't cutting-edge turned out to be an advantage, not a drawback. Their simple design made them inviting to people who'd never played a game before, and the correspondingly low price was an attraction as well. Games weren't just for 9-year-old boys and geeky adults anymore. Suburban moms played Game Boy games. Grandparents played them. Game Boys were found in boardrooms, in the homes of movie stars, in the White House. And sure, 90% of these new gamers were just playing Tetris over and over again, but the point is they were playing. Broadening the customer base for video games like this was a remarkable achievement, and I think it's actually made more remarkable because this wasn't the first time Nintendo had done it. 9 years before the release of the Game Boy, when the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Famicom it was based on were both years away from being realized, before even the blockbuster that was Donkey Kong, Nintendo had already turned a stereotypically childish toy into an acceptable adult accessory, and found enormous profit in doing so. In the 2 preceding decades, Nintendo had made toys, and it had made games. It had even made electronic toys that felt kind of like games, and electromechanical games with a distinctly toy-like feel. But this was their first product to combine the cheapness and accessibility of a toy with the versatility of an electronic game. It was both a game and a toy at once, and the later success of the Game Boy would be unthinkable without it. The Game & Watch owes its existence to a confluence of 2 of the most powerful forces in the modern world: the exponential growth of component density on microchips, and boredom. Let's begin with that first part. Back in 1965, a trade journal called Electronics asked the head of Fairchild Semiconductor's R&D division, Gordon Moore, to make some predictions about how the electronics industry would evolve over the next decade. Over the course of this interview, Moore discussed many aspects of the business, but most famously, he said that the number of components that companies were able to put on an integrated circuit had essentially been doubling every year for quite some time, and he expected this trend to continue in the future. As Moore predicted, the doubling went on until he was asked about it a second time in 1975, when he revised his estimate down to the component density doubling every 2 years, which held true for another 4 decades or so. Some observers have claimed that it's still happening now. It's widely known as Moore's Law, even though it's nothing like a physical law, as Moore himself noted. And what it amounts to in terms of consumer electronics is that for a period of at least 50 years, devices that used integrated circuits would either have much more processing power to work with, or could get substantially smaller and still do the same job every couple of years. This exponentially increasing efficiency explains why video game consoles, which didn't even exist as a consumer product in the 1960s, could be sold for less than $50 a piece by the late 1970s. It's also how I'm able to be on this platform talking to you right now, using a personal computer to create a video that you'll eventually watch using your own personal computer or device. Unless you're at work, in which case, shame on you. Do you think this company's made of money? It's not just computers, though. Something as apparently simple as an electronic calculator was once an expensive appliance that only large organizations could afford to buy. Hewlett-Packard's first pocket calculator cost the modern-day equivalent of $3,000. Ordinary schlubs and school kids had to make do with older, non-electronic tools, like slide rules and books of formulas. In much of the East, including Japan, people just kept on using the abacus, a technology that dates back at least as far as ancient Rome. But by 1979, the advancements predicted by Gordon Moore had lowered the cost of a typical pocket calculator to around $15, less than $70 when you adjust for inflation, which put it within the reach of even the lowliest salaryman in Japan. And it was just such a person that Gunpei Yokoi spotted one day on the train to work, caught in the vice grip of that sneakiest of emotions, boredom. The man was fidgeting with his pocket calculator, randomly adding and subtracting and multiplying for no other reason than to escape the tedium of yet another long commute to work. If anyone asked what he was doing, presumably he could just say he was working out a problem for his job, so there was no risk of looking strange or childish. It was a simple solution to the kind of social bind that Japanese salarymen often found themselves wrapped up in. But Yokoi believed that Nintendo could improve it by making a proper electronic game that was just as portable as a calculator, and equally easy to hide. He shared his idea with Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, but wasn't too encouraged by the response he got. Yamauchi clearly had his mind on other things, and he was polite but not enthusiastic about the possibilities of this gadget. In retrospect, however, it seems that Yamauchi was just playing his cards close to the chest, as he often did. Soon after speaking with Yokoi, the same day as a matter of fact, he was in a business meeting with the head of the Sharp Corporation, the company which provided all the sensors for Nintendo's light gun toys, and he decided to bring up this brand new game idea at the meeting. As it happens, Sharp was Japan's largest manufacturer of calculators, and as part of its R&D, it had patented a number of improvements to liquid crystal display screens, an essential element of cheaply producing both calculators and digital watches. With its LCD expertise, Sharp could easily manufacture the screen that Yokoi's pocket game would require. Well, I say easily. Actually, both the techies at Sharp and Nintendo's electronics division, Research and Development 2, initially thought it might be impossible. Not necessarily because of the complexity, but because of the desired size. R&D 2 was headed by Masayuki Uemura, who understood Sharp's capabilities pretty well because he had started his career there in the 1960s. Uemura's division had recently seen great success with Nintendo's first home video game console, the Color TV game, which really wasn't much more than a collection of Pong clones. Even so, it was a considerable chunk of electronics which weighed almost 2 pounds and had to be plugged into a television to be playable. Thanks to the implications of Moore's Law, electronic games were already much smaller than their electromechanical equivalents, but there was a limit, especially when it came to displaying graphics. Calculators and digital watches have tiny screens, but the information they need to display is also extremely simple. And while there had been earlier handheld electronic games, mostly made in the United States, these addressed the display problem by being just as visually Spartan as a digital watch. Mattel's Auto Race, released in 1976, was one of the first, and it boiled the concept of car racing down to little red bars barreling down a set of monochromatic lanes. This is about as primitive as graphics can get. The first really famous electronic handheld game, Milton Bradley's Simon, also de-emphasized visuals, asking the player to repeat a pattern of musical notes by pressing buttons. The only visual element was a light behind each button that would blink to identify the note. To fit in all the detail that Yokoi wanted, the reasonable form factor would be something like a hardback book. What he asked for was something slightly bigger than a pack of cigarettes. It was a tall order, and neither Uemura nor his old colleagues at Sharp thought they could deliver it. But Yokoi and fellow tinkerer Satoru Okada, the heads of R&D 1, were just as sure that it could be done. So Yokoi set about designing the game, while Okada boned up on programming so they could make their own prototype and show it to Sharp and R&D 2 as a proof of concept. Their first game idea for this new system was Ball, a juggling game in which the player would move the two arms of a stick figure-like character simultaneously to keep a pair of balls arcing through the air. It was a simple but addictive concept, and as the game went on and the pace increased, it changed from a trivially simple chore to a nail-biting test of reflexes. The simplistic presentation concealed an underlying depth and challenge, not unlike that found in Taito's arcade game Space Invaders. Another essential contributor to the Game & Watch's appeal, which is easy to overlook these days, is the watch part. Yokoi's guiding philosophy for the device was that it should be something an adult could play with while avoiding the embarrassment of looking childish. The clock function made a Game & Watch console feel more like an accessory than a toy, and it was also a useful reminder that would keep busy commuters from getting so absorbed in the game as to lose track of time and miss their stop. Yokoi knew that he had to make the game fit the circumstances in which it would be played without causing trouble. There was no chance that Japan's conservative, buttoned-down society was going to change to suit his game. Thanks to the initiative of R&D 1, Ball went into production in April of 1980 and was a modest success on store shelves. Yokoi would actually have been happy to move on at this point. It was Hiroshi Yamauchi who insisted that he stick with the Game & Watch concept and develop it further. And so, what had initially been conceived as a standalone handheld game became a library of more than 50 titles, almost all of which were designed by Yokoi. Even more surprisingly, almost all of these games were hits. There was no clear bestseller among the various offerings in the Game & Watch lineup. They were all popular, partly thanks to a design strategy based on consistent technical improvements and new playstyles. Starting in 1981, Game & Watch consoles included an alarm clock feature, as well as colorful background elements. In 1982, Nintendo released Oil Panic, which was a pretty funny commentary on the previous decade's petroleum problems, but it also featured a unique hardware gimmick: action which took place on two screens at once, both housed inside a foldable clamshell case for easy storage. Later that year, the same hardware was used for a Game & Watch version of Nintendo's arcade hit Donkey Kong, which introduced a further innovation in the form of a directional control which allowed a player to move left, right, up, or down by pressing a single button, the famous D-pad. Not all of Nintendo's products would go on to use this. In fact, oddly enough, the Game & Watch version of Super Mario Bros., of all things, reverted to the older concept of separate buttons for each direction. But it did become an essential part of Nintendo's home console controllers for many years. By 1983, the system, which had been intended to serve specifically as a discrete time waster for adults, had already branched out into the wider market for handheld games. Plenty of adults played Game & Watch games, but so did lots of kids, and not just in Japan either. In fact, contrary to Nintendo's previous experience, the Game & Watch sold better in foreign markets than it did in Japan, capturing an international audience that didn't need to know any Japanese to appreciate its simple, wordless presentation. 20 years before, in the world of toys, Nintendo had been a niche player, a wildcatter that sometimes struck it big but struggled to achieve consistent profits. A decade later, in the arcade market, the company had turned from wildcat to copycat, achieving most of its success by piggybacking on the work of older pioneers like Taito and Sega. But in the handheld world of the 1980s, Nintendo was the innovator and the new leader of the pack. A few American companies had scouted out the field beforehand, but only tentatively and often unsuccessfully, while in Japan the idea barely existed. Nintendo's Game & Watch was far more profitable, and more fun, than any other game device in its category. If you've been paying attention to these last few videos, you could probably hazard a guess as to how Nintendo's old competitors reacted to this development. That's right, their first impulse was to copy Nintendo and try to beat it at its own game, just like Nintendo had done to them years before. And when I say old competitors, I mean old. It wasn't Sega, Namco, or Taito that picked up the gauntlet Nintendo had thrown. They were all busy making arcade games, and in Namco's case, an animatronic robot rock band. No, I'm talking about the toy titans Bandai and Tomy, which flanked Nintendo with their own electronic games in the early 80s, reigniting a competition that had been dormant for more than a decade. Bandai's efforts were mostly large tabletop games, based on licenses like Gundam, but they also included the LCD Solar Power, a pretty transparent Game & Watch ripoff aimed at the low end of the market. Its games included some interesting design features, like stacked LCD screens which allowed the background to change as you played. But the main gimmick was that they were all solar-powered, meaning you never needed to buy new batteries for them. This wasn't really a big deal at the time. The Game & Watch's 2-button batteries were cheap and easy to replace. But it certainly makes for a compelling contrast with later systems like the Sega Game Gear, which ate up batteries the way Pac-Man eats little yellow dots. Speaking of which, Tomy managed quite the coup when it secured the rights from Namco to make a tabletop version of Pac-Man in 1982. Tomy had actually been making electronic games for years at this point. One of their first was a Pong clone called Blip. And frankly, if the development of the video game industry had favored tabletop games instead of handhelds, this series might have been about Tomy instead. Like Nintendo, and future LCD game kingpin Tiger Electronics, Tomy thoroughly understood the value of brand integration. While Nintendo had incorporated Mickey Mouse, Snoopy, Popeye, and its own character Donkey Kong into the Game & Watch line, Tomy made games based on Hello Kitty, Lupin III, Tron, and eventually Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And of course, also Mickey Mouse. A lot of these games weren't particularly innovative in their gameplay, but they were a cheap way to enjoy your favorite media franchise, in a time before rampant merchandising and the internet had cheapened the idea of brand engagement. Around this time, the Swiss company Swatch had begun selling a range of digital watches, all of which had exactly the same components except for the case, which was available in an unfathomable range of colors and styles, including designs based on popular brands. Swatch was formed as a response to declining sales of traditional Swiss watches, and its business strategy was based on setting a price for each watch that practically made them an impulse buy. Low costs meant that Swatch could afford to make lots of different product batches, each in a different style and produced in small quantities to target a specific taste. When they sold one style out, they would have the option of making more of that type, or just switching to a new one and shipping that instead. It lent the more popular styles a certain cachet due to their rarity, although really every style was rare when you think about it, and gave customers the feeling that they were expressing themselves by choosing one Swatch over another. In attempting to understand what made both the Game & Watch series and its imitators so successful, I find that it helps to think of them as the Swatch of video games. They weren't as mechanically deep or visually impressive as arcade games, but they didn't have to be, any more than a cheap digital watch has to look or keep time like a Rolex. The important thing is that they were cheap and fun, and unlike previous games in the arcade or at home, they were personal. They belonged to you specifically and said something about you. That probably didn't matter much to bored Japanese businessmen commuting to work, but if they had been the only ones that bought the Game & Watch, we wouldn't be talking about it now. You can bet your butt it mattered to kids showing off to their friends at home or on the playground at school, just like Pokemon cards would matter a decade and a half in the future. The key factor that made this strategy work was the relatively low price point. The Game & Watch was sold in Japan for the modern-day equivalent of about $50. In the US, where the price level was higher, it was closer to $100. But this was still half the price of Nintendo's color TV game, and far less expensive than the Atari 2600. It bridged the gap between proper video game consoles and something as simple as a pocket calculator. But there was a downside for Nintendo in all this accessibility, the same one it had run into with its toys during the 1960s. Heavy competition. The technology it used to make Game & Watch wasn't unique to Nintendo, or even necessarily to Sharp. Any company with programming expertise and access to liquid crystal displays could make a game every bit as good as Nintendo's if they really wanted. And they did want, because by the mid-1980s, handheld games were becoming a very hot commodity. Success breeds imitation. Nintendo had benefited from being on the other side of that before, but now that it was out in front, the other toy and game manufacturers were the ones that had the privilege of drafting behind it. And most of them weren't any less innovative or resourceful than they'd been before. Tomy in particular was angling to take away a huge chunk of the market in 1983 with its new Tomytronic 3D series, which used a pair of LCD screens and a stereoscopic mount to add a third dimension to handheld games with only a slight increase in the price. And so, Nintendo pivoted once more. It didn't stop making Game & Watch games. You don't just give up on a market that lucrative. But its top talent, including Gunpei Yokoi, would focus their efforts elsewhere going forward. Donkey Kong had been a smash hit in 1981, so Nintendo might have followed that up by making a bid for arcade supremacy, but Yamauchi was still a little wary of that part of the market. Prior to Donkey Kong, the arcade had mostly been a money pit as far as Nintendo was concerned. Another home video game console was a much more sensible option at this stage. The home console market in Japan was still very disorganized in the early 80s, with low sales and no clear leader among the dozen or so consoles being sold. The global leader in this segment, Atari, didn't even have a presence in Japan at this point. It had made a deal with the Japanese Epic company to distribute the VCS in 1979, but that launch was a flop, and Epic eventually replaced Atari's product with its own CassetteVision, one of the more successful Japanese consoles. A decisive technological step forward could win the majority of the Japanese home console market for Nintendo. This was what Hiroshi Yamauchi was banking on. But he needed to make sure at the same time that Nintendo's next console was unique enough, not just the games themselves, but also the hardware, that it couldn't be easily copied, the way the Game & Watch was. So he told Masayuki Uemura of R&D 2 to get to work on a gaming machine that would benefit from all the lessons he had learned from selling toys, arcade machines, and electronic games. It would be a video game machine with toy-like qualities, similar to the Game & Watch. It would be inexpensive, to undercut rivals who focused too narrowly on cutting-edge graphics and processing. But it would also be more powerful than any previous device his company had produced, to take advantage of the immense progress that was occurring in the field of computing, and give the customer unprecedented value for money. It would be the Nintendo Famicom, later released in the United States as the somewhat altered Nintendo Entertainment System. For many, both those who played and those who observed, this was the beginning of Nintendo's prominence on the world stage. It's where the story really gets going. But for us, this is the end of the line. It's when Nintendo mostly stopped experimenting with different product types and settled down to become known for nothing more or less than making some of the most whimsical, innovative, and fun video games ever played. Next time, in the finale to this series, we'll take one final look at how the formative experiences of Nintendo's earliest years shaped its distinctive approach to making and marketing video games, what made Hiroshi Yamauchi such a great president, as well as what Nintendo lost when he finally retired, and where both Nintendo and its early competitors ended up after another 40 years of change.